noticed how Washington always says it's targeting a regime, and yet somehow the people always end up paying the bill? Cuba's government is not a victim, let's face it. It's communist, repressive, and basically allergic to liberty. But now we've got Raul Castro indicted, sanctions tightening, oil pressure building, and yet we get the same old promise. If we squeeze hard enough, somehow freedom pops out on the other side. Look, maybe accountability for Cuba is way overdue. But when the tool being used is Washington controlling trade, travel, energy, and perhaps even speech adjacent activism, the question changes. And it changes to this: are we advancing liberty or just expanding our own governmental power? That's the line we're walking today on Liberty Lens. And as usual, here to walk that line, as Johnny Cash might have sung, is none other than my friend and co-host, Mr. Mike Tomat. Mike, how are you doing today?
Doing good. And John, as usual, I love the way that you frame this up. I never know how exactly you're going to do it. I also appreciate the Johnny Cash reference, and I know what you mean. Yes, I will visit you when you're in prison. Okay, so don't worry about that. I'll probably wear blue instead of black. But
Folsom County, right?
yes, exactly. Or more in keeping with our discussion today, Guantanamo Bay.
Guantanamo Bay.
I agree with you that this is the basic tension between two sides of a debate about what are we going to do about Cuba. And it's particularly uncomfortable in my view because one side is an argument perilously close to don't do anything. And I don't think any of us are quite comfortable with that. Maybe we should be, maybe we shouldn't be, maybe that's part of the debate, right? But it is hard. We're libertarians and we don't believe in the government doing too much. And a big piece of being a libertarian is not wanting to see violence being used, particularly by the state.
Right.
Except when it's absolutely necessary. Okay, if that's your framework, as I think it is for most humans, right? Most humans do not believe in being violent when it's not necessary.
Right.
So I don't mean to say that libertarians have a market cornered on trying to avoid needless aggression. But with that as the framework, it is nonetheless difficult to say, and therefore we should allow the Castro regime, the communist regime that is in place in Havana today, even though the leader is no longer of a last name Castro, it's still a Castro regime. It's very difficult for us to swallow the idea we're going to leave that regime in power, a regime that has caused the downfall, certainly the downfall of the economy of the Cuban nation, but also in no small part inhibiting the development of the culture, the downfall of human rights, holding back the ability to develop socially, economically, technologically, in terms of advancing not even anything you would call a lifestyle or culture, but just basic human dignity has been stymied in Cuba. If ever there were an example of a nation that deserved an outside power doing something undemocratic, unlibertarian, violent, and aggressive in order to replace a regime, it would be Cuba. And so I think that's why it's worth having this discussion.
Agree with you, but I'm going to push back a little bit, right? Because what I agree with you. There's no excuses for the government of Cuba being what it is, right? I mean, it's easy very flippantly say, well, they're a communist regime, which is true. There are other communist regimes in the world. There are other people who are suffering under the boot of their authoritarian governments. So there's the philosophical point of why Cuba? Why would Cuba hold particular interest for us? If now we must also put it in the context of what President Trump often says, like, hey, we're not the world police. We don't need to be in NATO. We don't need to abide by treaties that do not directly benefit the United States. Um, and yet, when it comes to the whole Western hemisphere, where President Trump is very open. Hey, this is ours.
Yeah.
China and Russia, you could carve up the other uh, parts of the world. This is ours. Like, so not only is it unlibertarian, the question is it even American? It, in the sense that I don't see any way that we could justify, like, we don't like the Cuban regime, and yeah, we feel sorry. If we really, let me rephrase this a little bit for you, Mike, because I want to give you a chance to talk. In the Soviet Union, what did we say ultimately defeated the Soviet Union when you got right down to it? Right? Rock and roll, Coca Cola, and Levi jeans, right? You and I are, of the 80s. We always said that's what actually brought down the Soviet Union. The arms race, all that stuff. But on a cultural, winning hearts and minds, it was American capitalism. We are doing the opposite with Cuba. Why not open trade to Cuba? Why not allow unfettered immigrants to get to their relatives in Florida, in Little Havana, in New York, like, and have that migration? Totally cut off the commie government at its knees by saying we offer the better, and your people know it. That's why they're leaving in droves. But we're doing the opposite, right? We're doing
Mhm.
something in peace that we usually wouldn't even do during war, right?
Yep. I don't think there's a counter argument. There is a counter argument. It's not very good. You're absolutely correct. By the way, I would characterize the fall of the Soviet Union as being one step more complicated than that. The capitalism having been maybe half the puzzle, the other is that we drained Moscow's treasury through an arms race that they couldn't afford.
100%. But people came over to our side.
Yes, humans did, and to a certain extent, that was allowed by Gorbachev. Uh, we don't need to go down this particular rabbit hole. Um, People came over because they were primed because of our cultural invasion and the inability to maintain itself financially caused Moscow to lose a grip on the satellites, and all of a sudden you've got Boris Yeltsin coming to power. Okay, so you're absolutely right. I'm just pointing out it's slightly complicated. There is no example. I, Apologies in advance. You're going to get some pushback for this. There is no example where trade sanctions, financial investment sanctions, have caused a regime to fall. No such thing. There have been examples where a regime has fallen and there were sanctions in place, and we pointed to the regimes as an extra factor that helped hasten it,
Hmm.
right? People point to South Africa and people point to Serbia. Well, the Serbian government fell because we put sanctions in place and starved them of capital. Yeah, all that's true. And then we started bombing. Okay, so say what you will about the sanctions. At the end of the day, it took more than that, and it took you know Nelson Mandela fans would argue it took a hell of a lot more than sanctions to bring down the South African regime. So these things are complicated, but to your point, this just doesn't work. And I believe that we should be trying something different with regard to Cuba. I don't think we're out of cards to play, and therefore we need to go violent. But there are things that we can do. I would love to pursue your idea of greater trade, greater investment, and see what happens. I believe that the answer to the question that you posed quite correctly, why haven't we tried it up until now? What's the big difference? We've done it elsewhere. Why don't we try it in Cuba? Which is the most logical place to try it because it's only 90 miles away, right? Today, our trade with Cuba, which isn't zero, but is very small, somewhere between 5 and 10% of their total international trade. It should be half, right? The United States, in a free market world, would probably be more than half
I agree. I think half is being conservative.
Exactly. It would probably be more than half of international trade with Cuba. The only reason it wouldn't be 90% is because Cuba would quickly become so economically healthy, it would engage in more trade with Mexico and Canada and, yes, Venezuela and Colombia, and especially Chile, which we don't talk enough about. Okay. Why is it that we haven't done this? And I believe that the answer comes out of 1959, and it comes out of 1960 to 63, and it comes out of 1968, all of which is to say a lot of people in the United States are pissed off. It's retribution. A lot of people in the United States, from basically two groups. One, Cuban nationals who fled to Dade County, Florida. They're mad because they were forced to flee.
Of
Either
course.
they were forced to flee in order to get away from their government, or they were forced to flee because they were seeking a better life and realized that that was not going to happen if they stayed there. But either way you look at it, they're pissed off.
Right.
And international corporations is the other group. These corporations, mostly American, that were invested in Cuba and lost what today would be hundreds of billions of dollars of assets taken over by the Cuban government. The Cuban government, the revolutionary government, the Fidel Castro government, wasn't targeting American companies any more than anybody else. They took the property of all international companies, then all domestic companies, and then all private landowners and all private apartment building owners, everybody. They took most of the property in that country. Let that sink in.
Of course. Yeah.
That's rough stuff. So there's plenty of anger to go around. And to this day, there are American companies who believe, just like in Venezuela, this was highlighted, a few months ago. But just like in Venezuela, there are long-standing claims by American companies who believe that they were done wrong. They're correct about that, and that they are owed, and they don't want to hear, we're going to allow all kinds of trade and investment in Cuba, and you're not going to be made whole because of this. And Cuban nationals in Florida don't want to hear all of a sudden, we're going to have all this great trade and investment, and people are going to get wealthy, and they're not going to get their pound of flesh.
I mean, I could see that if this were the 70s. I could see that if that were the 80s. But look, I mean, you and I know
For
about.
Marco Rubio, it is.
Well, I was going to say, um, for most people,
Yeah.
even most politicians, right? We're talking about events that happened between 60 and 70 years ago. That's to give it a rough time frame, right? That's 2.5 human
Right.
generations.
Most of this was completed by 1969. To your point, 67 years ago. I'm sorry, 57 years ago.
Right, so it started in 1960, basically with the revolution, and then
January 1st, 1959. That's right.
and then you go with all the CIA plots, Operation Mongoose, and the Bay of Pigs, and literally,
American failure after American failure.
right. So we got to take some responsibility. Cuba, say as late as right December 31st, 1950. Right? I think, Mike, I remember my father telling me these stories. Cuba was viewed as the Las Vegas of the East Coast. It was
Las Vegas became the Havana of the United States because Las Vegas didn't exist for all practical purposes. Right, right, right.
but with historical perspective, Cuba was very U.S. friendly prior to the communist revolution. And as far as I'm concerned, you invest in foreign sovereign nations, them's the risks. You can't hold grudges. So there's a reason why you make a lot of money if you're
This be a lesson to chip manufacturers in Taiwan.
in Taiwan and wherever else, right? Like, it's part of an assumed risk, in my opinion. So, while I understand what you just said, other than the folks living largely in South Florida, but especially not for those in the halls of power in Washington, certainly not the policymakers. I refuse to say that this is a grudge. It shouldn't be a grudge. Like, it shouldn't be like, oh, they did us dirty in 1960 or, whatever, or the Mariel boat lift. I mean, this is ancient history politically. We're dealing with politicians who only look ahead to the next election. They don't even look their full term ahead, right? They're looking, I got elected to Congress. I'm a member of the House. 6 months in, I'm already forget policy. I'm looking to get reelected, right? I mean, let's be honest.
Yep.
So for politicians that have that short a memory span, they're like
Yep.
NFL cornerbacks. They've forgotten. Next play, let's move on, right? Right?
Hopefully, right.
Hopefully, right? So right now, while I appreciate the logic of what you said, Mike, do you really think that's the case? Again,
Yes, as a matter of fact, I'm going to go a foot further and say I know that it is, but it is split generationally. To your point, you're absolutely right. It's split generationally. As someone who has actually campaigned in District 20 for Congress, which went right up to the Dade County line, in Broward County, the Dade County line. I also worked as a cop for 11 and a half years on the Dade County line in Broward County. I knew not just hundreds of Cubans, I knew a lot of Cubans, right? And you can draw a line at who was born before and after 1968. The older generation, old enough for their parents to have schooled them, right? The resentment is huge. And if you were to drop sanctions against Cuba, which, by the way, requires Congress these days because we passed laws in the 1990s, we passed laws tying the president's hands. The president is not allowed to drop sanctions against Cuba, not completely. The oil embargo that's in place today, yes, but the president today is not allowed to drop sanctions against Cuba unless certain democratic steps are taken, which aren't going to happen in Havana. So the hands are tied. But if the president were to do that, half of Dade County would explode. This is the number one issue for folks born in the early 60s and earlier in Dade County. And the younger generation, not only do they not quite get it, something that grandpa's upset about and something that dad understands, but they're all like, gee, if these sanctions come off, I can buy a boat and start running stuff across the strait and make a lot of money.
And to your point, that aligns with the political party breakdown, right? So the older generation of Cuban Americans, like guys our age, and maybe if we had uh, adult children at that age, right, we would say, well, those folks, I think almost demographically, are registered Republicans. They always have been. They've never forgiven JFK for the Bay of Pigs, right?
Right. Or for anything else, by the way.
Right. And I think we may have said in an earlier episode, those were some of the most American Republican conservative voters you'd ever run across, right? They were everything you ever wanted, even in Trump world, MAGA world, for immigrants, right? The second their feet hit the sand in Florida,
they're pulling up the ladder.
Yeah, they're hey, go Republicans, go this, go that. The kids, like you said, who are like, say, in their teens now, in their early 20s, late 20s, maybe touching the mid 30s, right?
Yeah.
They tend now, I thought stunningly in talking to Martha Bueno, a friend of ours.
In Dade County. A libertarian in Dade County.
Yeah. She's like, those folks are going Democrat. They're not sticking around for dad.
A bunch are. And it speaks to the sclerotic nature of the old school Republican, the Marco Rubios of the world, to change with the times.
How much do you think that plays a part in policy? Now, I'm not so naive as to say politics has no role in our foreign policy. I'm not that naive. But I'm saying, given the historical precedence of saying free trade, not open borders, but relaxed immigration and free trade are the more proven path to knocking over regimes with less violence or no violence.
Yep.
How much should politics interfere in this? Is it a matter of holding on to Florida, a key swing state? Let's face it, if it were ever to go Democratic, it would be really bad.
I think it's a significant piece. I think this is a significant issue for Marco Rubio personally. Uh, a guy whose family is from Cuba, whose family is extremely resentful. He is personally extremely resentful of the Castro regime. I don't think that Marco Rubio stays awake at night figuring out how can we have a less aggressive, less interventionist way to drop the embargo, drop the blockade, increase trade, and flip the regime without any aggression. He's not worried about that. He's worried, how do I get rid of this regime, which is something that we have wanted to do for 60 years, 67 years, and we should finally be doing it. There is a theory, by the way, a political theory being bantied about in Washington, which is that President Trump is on a path for legacy purposes to take on the biggest challenges that he can think of per se, whether he has any advantage, any leverage, any particular expertise, whether this is a good moment to do it, doesn't matter so much. But for legacy purposes, he just wants to take on the biggest issues. Well, this is one of the biggest, right? Making sure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon, huge. Flipping the Castro regime in Cuba, huge. And so it just, I think, comes down to he and Rubio want this done. They don't want to wait the decade it would take for a more creative solution to take effect, which I think is to your point, I think it is the right solution. I think it is what we should be doing.
Right.
I don't get the impression that the current State Department or the current White House is particularly good at reading the lessons of history. And so I'm not optimistic that they will pursue a different path. Ironically, the one advantage that the administration does have is that it controls the House of Representatives and has quite a bit of leverage in the Senate, right? It has a majority of the Senate.
Right.
Enormous control by virtue of party politics is at its zenith, and personal control over the party is at its zenith in the hands of Donald Trump. If there's anything that would speak to this is the moment
Right.
to get Congress to change the law and drop the sanctions, it would be that. And that is not the path that these guys are going to choose.
Yes. And so, and listen, when you were talking, I did kind of put myself in Rubio's shoes, even though he is a generation younger than us. I get what he's saying, right? Because, I mean, look, I'm a Greek American. I still have to hear my mother's disdain for Turkey.
Yeah.
And
Right.
my
Of
mother,
course you do. Of course you do.
and my mother never had to
And the
live.
youngsters probably don't get that.
No, it'd be like the British and the Irish say. It's that type of thing. Chinese,
I
Japanese.
don't think the youngsters could find Cyprus with a map.
Now, here's the irony of it. My mother has never lived under Turkish rule. The island that she's from in Greece is closer to Italy than Turkey by far. It's practically a short swim to Italy from where we were from in Greece, right? But the cultural power of the lessons you were taught in school at her young age in the 40s and the 30s, right?
An
Like
iron grip.
has right. So to that extent, I understand Secretary of State Rubio saying this is a thing for me. This is what I have a strong belief in. I can excuse his zealousness for this. But we're not here to satisfy familial vendettas, right? We're not here to take on personal vendettas, I would think, as a nation. So, granted, I don't think this president understands free trade. And I don't mean that derisively. I just think he doesn't understand free trade. He's interested in what he calls fair trade, not free trade.
Right.
So I don't think he doesn't see the power of free trade being able to solve this issue. I understand that.
I agree with you. I just don't think he does. I think Marco Rubio has one blind side, Trump has another blind side, and those blind sides are aligning in order to prevent them taking advantage of their ability to have the law change and drop sanctions.
However, I have to ask you this. Do you think we're at the point or in danger of falling into the situation where the knee-jerk reaction for this administration is, I see it, I want it, I will take it? We've seen it with Venezuela. We're seeing it with Iran. Right now, we're in the middle of it with Iran. We see how it could be cold in the other direction. We have no interest in Ukraine. That war is still raging. That was supposed to be solved within 3 days, if I recall a campaign promise of President Trump taking office. That's still raging on, right? And I think it's very simple. He doesn't see a vested interest in Ukraine. He did in Venezuela. He does in Cuba. He does in Greenland. That might still be a pending thing. Maybe he's waiting till after the midterms. I don't know. So, generally speaking, Mike, do you think that this is now the policy? Whether right or wrong, the policy is we see it. If we can take it, we will. Because,
Absolutely. I would say it's not quite we will take it, but we will decide whether to take it. In other words, the policy is if it's in our sphere of influence, geographically speaking, we do what we want. And if that means violence, if it means extracting someone, right, with a dubious warrant, whatever it, I don't think the White House views this hemisphere as requiring a very high bar to be cleared before prosecuting its interests with aggression as necessary to accomplish what it is that they might find as their objective at any point in time. So, for this reason, I would be very nervous about avoiding aggression in Cuba. I think it's a real shame. I think it's missing a huge opportunity. The alternative of doing nothing hasn't worked very well. The alternative of leaving recent sanctions in place is a huge humanitarian crisis
right.
in the making. Already a humanitarian crisis, but a huge humanitarian crisis in the making. For the benefit of viewers and listeners, we should point out that as we speak, the United States is prosecuting an embargo against oil coming into the nation. This is in addition to an embargo on most products and services coming from the United States going into Cuba. But in addition to that, now you can't get oil in from any nation without the United States permission.
Hmm.
This is a problem. It allowed one tanker in March from Russia. But without oil coming in, the nation is starving of oil. Pardon me. And that means that the nation is economically melting down. It's very difficult for the typical Cuban to put his hands on basic commodities. Food is becoming astronomically expensive. We have not yet tripped into starvation, but that is the next. That is what I would fear if this goes, say, the rest of the year. I would fear that this turns into a true humanitarian crisis.
And as maybe Ron Paul would point out, you're just building up anti-U.S. resentment because it's as bad as life was under the Cuban communist regime. Rather, you're making it worse. You're not alleviating. Like if someone's on the starving, but at least has enough oil available to heat up his home, you're like, okay. But now if the U.S. comes along and says, no, no, we're not going to solve your starvation issue for you, and we're going to make it that you're freezing overnight in your own home.
Absolutely. And John, the bifurcation of the political issue by generation in the United States has a mirror image in Cuba, especially in Havana. The older folks remember the United States as a trade partner and have fond memories of what it is that they had known and had learned about the United States from their childhood. For youngsters, my children's age, 30, 32, and younger, they grew up in a world in which there was not information available about the United States except what the Castro regime told them. And the Castro regime has been telling people that the reason they're not doing well economically is the United States embargo, which is largely not true. It has hurt, it hasn't helped, right? But the big problem with the economy in Cuba is the crappy communist regime trying to control everything, and the effective erasure of property rights. That's, those are the two big issues in Cuba that have undermined the economy. But everyone has been told, all the youngsters believe that the United States is, I hesitate to use the term great Satan, but you get the parallel, right? And
Right.
so, we're coming into a generation in the United States, especially in Florida, especially in Dade County, that is increasingly open to a deal.
Right.
But in Cuba, especially Havana, we're coming into a generation that increasingly distrusts the United States and believes the United States is the cause of all of their problems.
Yeah, and to be fair, why wouldn't they? Like you said, the younger generation doesn't know any different. Like guys our age can in Cuba remember like the American companies coming over and investing, building nice hotels, the tourist trade, the money that was associated with that. So you're absolutely right.
And Cuba, to be fair, nothing fair, but Cuba's in bad shape. Cuba is in bad shape. I don't know how many of our viewers have actually been to Cuba. I have had the opportunity to spend several days there, and I can tell it's been a while. It's been a decade, uh, but I can tell you that there are buildings quite literally falling apart. You need to be careful not to get hit by a brick falling off of a wall, because walls are falling apart because roofs have disappeared, because there are no property rights giving people an incentive to fix the roof. That's how bad it is. It's just, and everyone is familiar with this idea that cars from the 1950s are still rolling around. Well, that's not nostalgia. That's because that's what they have to work with, right?
That's literally the example that was bouncing around my head as you started. I said, yeah, they still have 1956 Buicks rolling around Havana because that's all they could get their hands on, and they don't have their own car making facilities.
You have to go to a car show or, up on blocks where I live, if I can throw my own community under the bus, to see an old car. But there, it's what the taxis look like.
How much do you? Let's move on a little bit. Like in terms of the playbook the Trump administration is using right now. Now they haven't said, I think, definitively that they're out for regime change. They haven't definitively said it. President Trump has kind of hinted at it. He refuses to rule it out. And we kind of see the same playbook starting as with Venezuela. I'm referring to.
The
Uh,
indictment of Raul Castro
Parallels the indictment of Maduro
for a crime committed 30 years ago,
for a crime committed 30 years ago.
for which he probably is criminally responsible.
We're not here to defend Raul
But
Castro.
it does. No, we're not. He's a bad guy who should go to jail. But I query, how is it that we weren't able to build this case, say, 28 years ago?
Right. And now Raul Castro is 94 years old. He's not getting extradited anywhere, at least not voluntarily or even near voluntarily. So, Mike, despite let me rephrase the question. Do you tend to take the president at his word that he's not interested in regime change?
No, 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 no. The president, it's the only objective that makes sense. There's nobody in the White House who's going to argue that for humanitarian purposes, uh, we need to lock down the nation's access to oil. That's going to make everything better. I mean, what are we doing? The only objective that makes sense is regime change. In that sense, I don't think the president has to say one way or another. It's obvious that there isn't anything else one would want from Cuba other than regime change. So, in that sense, I think it's fairly clear that that's what we're going for. Of all the weird things that a libertarian might say, John, let this be the strangest for me personally today. I don't even think this is about ethics anymore. I
Oh,
think this is about practicality.
sure.
What would be my criticism of the administration while I think it has ethical implications, I wouldn't accuse someone necessarily of having bad intentions. I just believe that the administration is misreading history, to your point, misunderstanding trade, and therefore coming up with bad policy, right?
Right.
If we all agreed that the Castro regime has to go, how do you do that? And
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but this is the part I
yeah,
want to jump in, right? So as flimsy as the facade was to remove Maduro, to send troops to remove him, legally, I think it's the Helms-Burton Act. I'm looking at my notes. I think it's the Helms-Burton Act.
Burton of 1996.
I It was in the 90s. You're right. If you're going to affect that sort of change, regime change, it must be in the pursuit of in other words, you got to have a democratically elected leader of the nation you're changing. So technically, when they did that with Maduro, the vice president there, even though she was a Maduro aligned puppet and might be a Trump administration puppet for all we know, more than likely, um, it was legal according to the Helms-Burton Act because you had a democratically elected vice president ready to assume power as the result of our actions.
And let me slice that one layer more nuanced. Helms-Burton didn't make it illegal. It was already illegal for other reasons.
Okay, what did Helms-Burton do specifically then?
No, I'm agreeing with you. Helms-Burton didn't make it illegal. That's not quite the same thing as it made it legal. The warrant was still illegal. It was still a violation of international law. Okay. And it was a violation of the Constitution because it was an act of war. It was 0 for 3 in terms of those legal. Right. Helms-Burton did not create a fourth reason for it to be illegal.
All right. But in Cuba, there's a slightly different thing, right? There is no democratically elected government per se, right? It's still basically, for lack of a better term, a monarchy, a dictatorship. Pick any word for complete autocracy that you want, right? How does it work? Okay, you've got the warrant for Castro. Castro technically is not in power anymore. Plus, he's a 94-year-old man. So it sort of mirrors the playbook of Venezuela in the way the chess pieces are, the board is being set up, right? But the end game is not the same technically because all right, you go and nab Castro. Let's say who I forget the gentleman's name who's actually in charge of the
Yeah,
Cuban government right now.
right. But it is, to your point, it's hard to imagine that the Havana regime is going to feel pressure to change just because you sent 85 Marines to extract a 94-year-old former leader.
I'd have him on a raft waiting for the 85 Marines.
Yeah, right. If that's going to make everything copacetic, here he is.
Take them, right? We'll send them to you if you leave us alone. And I'm sorry, it was President Miguel Diaz-Canel. That's the current president of Cuba, right? So if Diaz-Canel says, "Oh, really? Is Castro going to be the one to make this all go away? Here, take him. Take
Right.
his wife, take his family. We don't care. He's gone now, right?
We'll trade you for oil.
Right, exactly. Who wouldn't take that if you're Cuba in the face of U.S. aggression, right?
The
So
answer being someone who's ethical, but okay, yeah. But
okay, but if ethics were an issue, we wouldn't be in the problem we're in right now. But here's the thing, right? So what is the end game in that sense as a justification for the U.S. right? You could talk about humanitarianism. You could talk about the indictment against Castro, but if I'm Canal, I'd be like, okay, take him. You want him, right? Okay, he's a murderer. Take him. Go ahead. Have him face justice in a Florida courtroom. Fair enough, or a Washington courtroom. Take him. Now leave us alone. Now, what reason do you have
yeah,
to
yeah,
enforce sanctions and everything, right? So
yeah.
how does this play out, Mike?
This plays out very, very badly. It depends on how much political capital the White House believes it has. A lot of this will come down, I'm guessing, to how the Iranian war progresses. If it lingers on, the White House may eventually say it's time to take other military action. If the White House feels like the Iranian action is lingering on, but it's losing political capital, particularly if they don't take action before the November election, if the November election goes badly, if the White House does not get the midterm results that it seeks and feels like it has lost some political capital, one could imagine the calculus gets very weird, I guess, is all I would tend to predict about that regarding whether action is taken against Cuba of a aggressive nature. What I fear is that neither your idea nor Trump's first idea of aggression or your idea and mine of getting rid of the sanctions, right, will be pursued. Neither one of them. And I fear that the administration will languish because of all kinds of political calculations, allowing the current sanctions and oil embargo to remain in place. And that makes the Cuban economy very, very different than before the embargo. You know, it was one thing to say only food and medicine can come from the United States to Cuba. For everything else, Cuba is going to have to trade with the rest of Latin America and Europe and Canada and Russia and China and India, right? Which is going to be expensive for Cuba, but they can get what they need, right?
Right.
There's a big difference between that, the previous trade regime, and where we are now, which is you can't have energy. That's a big deal. You can't go. It's it's the difference between having food and having water in the desert, right? You can go a long time without food. You're not going very long without water. The Cuban economy cannot go very long without oil.
Correct.
So if this trade regime stays in place, the embargo against oil stays in place the rest of the year, Cuba's in big trouble. And I don't know what that looks like. If it stays in place next year, that is a humanitarian crisis that not only is a problem, an ethical problem and a real problem and a livelihood problem for the 8 million people of Cuba, but it is also a problem of such a huge proportion that it will erode international support for the United States government.
Right, and we're not gaining as many we're not getting as much of support as we once had in general. And
We're not winning friends lately anyway.
No, you're absolutely right. And to the extent that this may be, that may in fact turn out to be the case, right? That if the Iran war continues to go poorly, and it really isn't going well for the U.S. Comparatively speaking, right? If it continues to, if Iran continues to be in this sort of like stasis where the straits is still shut down, oil is, now you hit November, as you said, let's say the Republicans don't have the expected victory that President Trump thinks he's going to have. You're right. Maybe the default then is just like, well, I could see two actions, right? One is, hey, we've got to gin up the patriotic spirit. Let's go invade somebody. And then Cuba rises to the top of the list.
Yep.
And the second one is, unfortunately, what you said. Okay, they're going to die without us lifting these sanctions. Let's be honest, right? We are slowly choking the island, and we're not choking the leadership per se, because they'll figure out they're the first in line to get anything that's available, right? So you're not choking out.
Absolutely. This is why sanctions don't work.
Exactly. You're choking out the people, who, and then of course you make them more susceptible to Russian influence, Chinese influence, and every other bad influence in our own hemisphere. So it's just like you said, it's like the most wrong-headed approach that you could come up with.
Yeah, it ain't going to work. To your point, the only tanker allowed through so far was Russian, which I find weird.
Yes. Very not weird. Well, it's weird to you and me. It's not weird to President Trump, right? Because for say whatever you want, he's not as aggressively, hardline against Putin. So yeah, okay, I get it.
Yeah,
Um,
hopefully he extracted something from Moscow in exchange, but I don't know what that would be.
I don't think so, but okay. Um, but at home is the final push a PR campaign, right? So you're going to have, you said Secretary of State Rubio is going to be out there thumping his fist and talking about his family's experiences and making it very personal for the American people. You also have the thing now that if you do not support regime change in Cuba, you yourself might be a communist and anti American. Now, I just want to bring up this sort of like contextual thing, Mike, because let me get your things on. Hasan Piker, YouTube guy, influencer, TikTok, whatever platform you want. Uh, the guy is one of these far left wing nut jobs. In my opinion, he's got
The
communist,
highest ratio of followers to economic understanding in the world.
which is a tough sell in this world. But I
That's
get
tough. That's tough. I include people like Joe Biden in that pool. I,
you.
I, I think Hasan Piker has exceeded even the GOAT, Joe Biden, in terms of ratio of
Economic
followers to
followers. Yeah,
understanding of economics.
yeah. And that's saying something. If you've ever been on Thread or Blue Sky, one of the left winging X versions, it's like you've got folks who are seriously advocating for $1,000 an hour minimum wage so that everyone can afford a palace in the Hamptons. But even among that crowd, Piker stands out, right? Now, he, as part of a trip, went to Cuba. And I'm looking for the Hassan Piker, Medea Benjamin, were two folks who went to Cuba
Yep.
as part of, I'm assuming, some sort of humanitarian effort.
Yep.
And they've gotten subpoenaed
Yep.
by OFAC, the Office
Right.
of Foreign Asset Control, I think.
Yep.
Um,
Treasury Department, U.S. Treasury
now,
Department.
right, the U.S. Treasury Department, this is a sub office of that. Okay.
Yep.
So he got subpoenaed. And right now, it's very plausible that he got subpoenaed to provide information about sanctions enforcement,
Yep.
right? Talk to me about whether you think this is a thinly, and I mean very thinly veiled attempt of the Trump administration to start controlling the narrative, the dissident narrative around Cuba in this country. Do you think this is that attempt in preparation for we might have to make one of those Venezuelan midnight raids,
Yeah.
grab Castro, and while we're at it, maybe grab Canel too while we're down there if we run into.
Completely possible. I don't know how to handicap that, maybe 50-50. That, well, let me back up. Very likely that the administration is completely aware of how this Piker fella feels about things, and that he's on the wrong side of the debate, wrong side of the argument, wrong side of the political divide. And yes, they would love to put the screws to him, not only as a matter of just they want to do that, but also because a lot of the president's followers would like that. So it's, red meat to the base. That's a virtual certainty, right? That is part of the administration's calculus. Is it also the case that it is possible that what Piker did is illegal? Yes, that is possible. I we don't have the facts, right? We don't have the facts. It does strike me as ticky tack foul stuff in the middle of a build up to war, that we're worried about whether or not someone had the right license to sell food in Cuba. It may be more significant than that, but that's the way it reads so far, right? Is we haven't seen the accusation, so we really don't know. But having said all that, there is another thing that is true about this, which is that Piker himself is using this
Sure, of
as, a thinly veiled PR stunt.
course, of
And
course.
that doesn't mean, like every other human, he doesn't wish well the people of Cuba. I'm sure he does. I don't mean, I'm not trying to be that disparaging. Just because he's a communist doesn't mean he doesn't want well for people.
Right.
But is this a PR stunt? Of course it is.
Of course, yeah,
If he could get himself arrested, would that be a great day for him? Of course it would be. He would love it, right? And to get arrested by the Trump administration to boot, oh my goodness, I don't know how it could get any better for him,
right.
right? And for the prosecution to go all the way through. So I think this is politics on politics as opposed to enforcement on humanitarian aid type of battle. Yes, there's an enforcement argument. Yes, there's a humanitarian effort underneath, and those two things might end up being at odds. But I think largely this just comes down to a Republican and a Democrat, and they're going to punch it out any way they can.
Well, of course. I mean, the only difference, of course, being is while Trump can throw Piker in a cage, Piker can't throw Trump in a cage, right? That's
Right. And so it is lopsided. On the other hand, Piker can say anything he wants and make $1 million off it off his podcast. I think one of the open questions, to your point, one of the open questions is if Marco Rubio decided, if his family decide, right? Marco Rubio's nephew, I have no idea whether he has a nephew, but imagine if someone in his family decided to rent a boat and run aid to Havana, right? And said something like, I support what President Trump is doing. And in the meantime, I'm going to demonstrate that the American people are generous and have the goodwill and the good health of the Cuban people in mind and in heart. And so, I'm going to help out in any way I can, but I support the president. I don't think that person is going to get prosecuted.
of course not. Of course not.
To your point. To your point.
It's very clear that that would be the case, right? And look,
And it
half
could be the same legality.
right. I'm not sure, right? I'm not sure, but I'd venture a guess that a lot in the halls of power in Washington, at the end of a long day of policymaking and propping up American values and all that sort of fun stuff, I wouldn't be surprised if someone kicked back with a fine scotch and a Cuban cigar. I am sure that happens. I am so sure it happens. I know it happens on
I know you meant bourbon from Kentucky, but
bourbon from Kentucky,
I
whatever.
know that that's what you meant.
Yes, I'm not a drinker, so I'm assuming. But here's the point, right? Those people are obviously hypocritical, right? Because if they're enjoying a Cuban cigar, they're in a trade violation, right? Or if they went through Canada to get it, or whatever the case may be. So there is a little bit of hypocrisy. And Mike, before we wrap up, one last thing, and I'm being super paranoid here because I still have a son who would fall into this age range. I hear rumblings here and there about the draft coming back.
Yep.
And with all these military actions that the president is at least considering,
Yep.
the ones he's executed and the ones he's considering,
Yep.
and Secretary of Defense Hexeth with his rah-rah attitude and
Yep.
some would say overzealous attitude of
Yep.
how the military is supposed to operate.
Yep.
My guess is that recruitment may need a boost here and there.
Mm.
There's been rumblings of the draft.
Yep.
Talk to me about that because there
Not
are
going to happen. Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. It is not going to happen. It is the most divisive and the most unpopular policy one could choose. Short of passing a law that says, babies can't have milk, that is the most divisive and the most politically dangerous and unpopular policy a politician could choose in the United States for all the reasons you can think of. And then let me throw one more on the pile.
sure.
A generation, 2 generations of military leadership has said the draft is a bad idea, that we like having a volunteer army. It's expensive. You got to pay people to get them in, right? You got to pay them to come in. You got to pay a bonus. You got to pay their education, and the food better be good, right? So it's expensive. I get that, but military leadership has said now for 2 generations, one of the reasons why our military is so effective is because it is so professional. It is so professional because it is so expensive. It is so expensive because it's volunteer. And so it would be very difficult for a variety of reasons to reverse that. I think that a lot of this, we have said many times on the show that foreign aid is a bad idea for a variety of reasons, right? It might feel good for the moment, but it doesn't get you what you think it's going to get you. It rife with corruption, manipulation, leakage, and just ineffectiveness. It just doesn't buy what the American people think that it buys, right? That's a problem. Sanctions are the other side of exactly the same coin. Think of sanctions as being negative foreign aid. As ineffective as foreign aid is, sanctions preventing economic development just as ineffective at getting what it is that you want to get. And that's why we're talking about military solutions, because we have so bungled other solutions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that military solutions are any good. I think the government, I think the Trump administration believes that it has at its disposal all of the military resources that it needs, particularly through the National Guard. And one of the movements in one aspect of the liberty movement, a big aspect inside the Republican Party, is the movement toward what we call defend the guard legislation at the state level, which would make it very difficult for any future White House to mobilize without a declaration of war the National Guard from any state, right, without gubernatorial approval and action. And I think, speaking of backlash, it's actually more likely that the administration's warming to aggression in this hemisphere and else in the Middle East, right? It's more likely that that leads to a backlash toward things like defend the guard rather than the other direction toward a draft.
I understand that, but I'll play devil's advocate and say that subtlety and forward thinking may not necessarily be the strong suits of someone like a Pete Hegseth. Would the draft be something that has to be congressionally
Yeah.
approved?
By the way, I agree with you. I agree with you. On that, I don't know what the counter argument would be. Um, yes, it would require congressional approval at this point. Um, it, ostensibly, given the things that not only this White House but past White Houses have gotten away with without congressional approval and without a declaration of war, would it be possible to institute a draft and, if I can choose my words snarkily, dodge uh, court rejection and dodge congressional pushback? Is that possible? Yeah, I think it is. I guess if you're a stickler for the law and the Constitution, that's one thing. But your question may be one more of practical realpolitik, and I don't know how that would play out, come to think of it.
Yeah, yeah, that is always an issue, right? Because uh, we've seen that the president does things first and asks for forgiveness later. And
And the courts have been very deferential, and the courts do not want to get in between the legislative branch and the executive branch. And the legislative branch doesn't want to go against party politics, and the president controls the party. So,
yes,
you know, that question that you posed could apply to a whole lineage
oh,
of
uh,
things.
of of course. And one of the things that concerns me is, I was watching, I was going over the news this morning, and Bill Pulte being named acting uh, the head of DNI, acting head of DNI to replace Tulsi Gabbard. And here's a guy who is basically a mortgage guy, right? That's what he does. He's been running Fannie and Freddie, and
He
he's put in
started out
charge
a
of
home
DNI,
builder.
and he started a home building. So I could see where President Trump says, this is one of my type of guys. We kind of have the same background and everything. I don't necessarily know that he's qualified to lead DNI.
Of course
And
he's
you
not.
combine that,
No, let me
of
jump in.
course.
Of course
But
he's
the
not.
reason I mention it, Mike, sure, go ahead. Yeah.
No,
Okay, he's not.
no, he's not. He's a lot of people say he's a good guy. I don't mean anything disparaging. Um, I would not consider myself qualified to be the DNI, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say with a great deal of confidence, I think I know more about how international systems work than Bill Pulte does. But I don't think that either one of us should be the DNI. This is a guy who, yes, got involved in housing finance and then got involved in housing finance in this administration and greenlighted the investigation of political opponents of the president
Sure.
having filed mortgage applications and misrepresented the status of their second homes. That's what ingratiates Bill Pulte to the White House.
Right. It's his personal loyalty to the president. But the reason I brought him up, because he's the most recent example of those generations of military leaders. I use the analogy that you mentioned for a reason that you're confident that we may not go to a draft, is those people have been leaving this administration in droves, right? Like a lot of generals, a lot of admirals have left the Pentagon in protest, or they were fired. Take your pick, whose version you believe. The point is, they are no longer there. The Secretary of the Navy, no longer there, right?
Yeah.
So do you still have that generational wisdom you referred to that would pop up and say, hey, boss, and boss says, if you're talking to Hegseth and Trump in the same room, we understand what you want to accomplish, but this is a really bad idea. Are you afraid that too many of those people are no longer in the administration?
I'm going to double down on no, I'm not afraid of it, because this is so central to the Defense Department's culture for so long, right? It, no one in the Defense Department today was drafted. Let that sink in.
Wow.
And so I'm
Yep.
going to double down and say, no, it would be such anathema. It would be so weird that you could not put together a panel of military generals and admirals that would support a draft. And the pushback would be so strong. Look, I've been wrong about a lot, so don't take out a mortgage and bet it all on what I'm saying, right? But I think the pushback would be so strong that it would actually uh, embolden politicians. I think the Senate would finally say, this is a bridge too far.
Okay. Let's hope so.
Yes.
All right. So that's it for this episode of Liberty Lens. Mike, before we go, please tell us about anything that might be on your mind that you'd like to promote.
We want to talk about Freedom Fest. Everyone should go to Freedom Fest. Freedom Fest is a big liberty-minded conference. A lot of Republicans, a lot of libertarians, a lot of people that aren't members of a party. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's in Vegas. It's July 8, 9, 10, and 11. You can get $100 off if you email me, mike@miketermott.com. There's 2 A's in Termott, but it's worth $100 to try to figure out my email address if you want to register for Freedom Fest. I will be there making, you ready? An unprecedented announcement, an announcement of a political campaign unprecedented in 250 years of American political history. Take that to the bank. Someone recently challenged me on this, and I was able to knuckle them under. This is unprecedented. No one has ever made an announcement like the announcement we're going to be making July 9 at Freedom Fest. I don't know if I mentioned Freedom Fest, but Freedom Fest is where I would encourage everyone to be in that second week of July in Las Vegas. I mentioned it's in Las Vegas.
You did not, but it's all in the information right there on the screen, everyone. Yes, join Mike. Join us at Freedom Fest, and Mike can get you a good deal. Send him an email.
$100 off. I don't know if I mentioned that.
Yeah, or go to his website. The address is right there. Feel free to do it. Also, do us a big favor, like and subscribe to the podcast. It really helps us out with the YouTube algorithm. It gives us a reason to keep doing these episodes. All right, until next week when we do this again. For Mike Maat, this has been Big John. Peace, everyone.